Hello. Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. My computer told me to check my speaker, so it kind of freaked me out. Okay, so good, good, good. So Shanice and Rigoberto, it's nice to have you. Hope you guys enjoyed your spring break. Let's see here. All right. Great, great, great. All right, I'm not sure if you guys have had a chance to take a look at your handout yet. Sorry it took me so long to get it up. I think I put it up like yesterday evening. But I wanted to give you context as far as the American War for Independence and a few different popular interpretations to it. And then I have a somewhat of a thesis that I try to convey in the last section about Latin America and in Mexico. So before we go, are there any questions or comments? All right. So let's see here. It starts off with context to the American War for Independence, and you do see some similarities and some differences between the War for Independence in the United States and in Mexico and beyond in Latin America. But a few things definitely seem to coalesce. But starting with the U.S., most narratives, as you see in red there, they mention demographic changes that happened in the 1700s, political ambiguity regarding the rights of the colonists as Englishmen, and certain sources of stress upon Mother England at that time. And then, of course, also I could have put on here, especially if you are kind of romantically bent on the subject, is the Enlightenment. And so certain ideological forces as well, which I might even put that right now. So let's see here, political ambiguity. Ideological forces and certain sources of stress. All right. So demographics, at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, the British felt like they needed to have a appraisal of the New World that they had just won by conquest against the French, North America and the North American colonies. And you notice right between 1750 and 1770, which is crazy, just in 2 decades, asserts historian Gordon S. Wood, the colonies doubled in number from 1 million colonists to 2 million. And many of them flocked to cities. Many of them flocked to the frontier. And so the British felt a sense of responsibility, like, hey, okay, now we've just won this territory. Now we need to administer it properly. And so that was one reason for the confrontation between Great Britain and the States and the colonies. Also, political ambiguity. English common law, as you see there, is an amalgamation of judges' decisions, historical traditions, royal edicts, and parliamentary laws. It's not one definitive written document like it is here in the US. So that leaves room, arguably, for loopholes to be discovered, for ambiguity as far as contradictory decisions made by judges, laws that don't seem to coalesce from one year to another year. And so that opened it up for various interpretations to English common law. But with the colonists, right, there were a few things that they stood by. One is some of the decisions made were by jus soli, and that is your place of birth. And so if you were born on English soil, and that includes Scotland, that includes the North American colonies, under as of 1707 would be called Great Britain. Then by nature of being born in British controlled territory, you would claim the right of subjectship, of being a subject to the crown, and the closest thing to modern notion of citizenship. You also had jus sanguinis, right? Like sangre in Spanish is by blood. And so that even if you were born outside the realm of the British Empire of Great Britain, if your mother or father, and it differed from judicial decision to another, if your mother or father were English, you could apply for subjectship and say, on the basis of the blood of my English mother, my English father, I am an English subject. And then also you have the charters, the 13 separate charters that were issued and under different kings. And so you had some like James I to the Jamestown settlers. You had Charles II, after his dad had been beheaded by parliamentary forces in the English Civil War, was in a generous mood, if you will. Certain English kings made it clear in the charters, as you see here, had written assurance that migrants from England, if they should go to the northern colonies in America, North America, they would enjoy the full rights of Englishmen in those colonies. So in several colonies, it was made explicitly clear that they have the rights of Englishmen. And yeah, and then you have other components to it as well, as far as just ambiguity and different interpretations. You have denizenship, where you have temporary rights of Englishmen granted by the crown. It's supposedly very complex. Just I've only read one book strictly on the legal dimension of this. Let's see here. Then you also have the fact of stresses in the British Empire. One was the debt that they had fallen into from the French and Indian War. They needed to raise money to get the nation out of debt, and they wanted the colonists to carry their weight, especially since they were so rich in number, and especially since on paper, ostensibly, the British could claim that they were at least partially fighting the French and the native allies to the French also for the colonists, so they could have secured British rights, and they could have rights to Western lands, etc. So at any rate, you have that as well. Notice here, there was visible protest and organized opposition to King George III and his government throughout England. And so he was dealing with drama in his own country. John Wilkes was raising a lot of ruckus, contending that not all the boroughs or districts were represented in Parliament. And he ran and rightfully won, from what I've read, in his borough. And King George III refused to allow him to take a seat. You had two guys named Gordon and Trenchard, and they wrote Cato's Letters. And in that, they espoused Enlightenment as well as Scottish libertarian, and we can get to both of those, Enlightenment, Scottish libertarian ideals. And they connected those ideals to the events that were going on in England to alarm the English people and Scottish people, and contend that, see, you're not receiving the rights that you are naturally entitled to, and that the crown is trying to usurp more and more power to itself, and that you need to be aware of that. So there were issues going on in England itself. Then you had riots and rebellions in the colonies through the 1720s up into the War for Independence in the 1770s. You had the Regulator movement in North Carolina. You had the New Jersey militia mutiny. In other cases, you had complaints of the within Massachusetts that the elected assemblymen were not doing their jobs and they were neglecting the people. You had bread riots, you had tax protests, you had people going to the periphery of the different colonies and founding, trying to establish new villages or towns and wanting to immediately be represented in the assembly of their colony. And some of the assemblymen denying them that representation. And so you had drama going within the colonies themselves. And according to Howard Zinn, you had a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in the 1700s that was especially visible in the cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City, where you had a lot of paupers, a lot of homeless people materialize, and a lot of class consciousness, people becoming aware of what class they belong to, and almost feeling an xenophobic sentiment toward people outside their class. So the colonies were far from united at this time when war broke out. And then, of course, you have the confrontational taxes and edicts made by Parliament, but of course approved by King George III. But that's one of many ironies of history, is it was actually the Parliament, the elected Parliament of England, that passed these edicts that we protested, not King George III. But of course, you have the Sugar Act. They ordered that all tax collectors return to their posts because they were known as customs officials. They were kind of like the highway patrolmen to enforce the mercantilist restrictions. And the mercantilist restrictions dictated who could do what economically. Because remember, we didn't have a capitalist system under England. It was technically mercantilist, so that the crown decided to whom certain opportunities and certain resources were open. And he was unapologetic, he or she ruling and Parliament were unapologetic about that. They granted monopolies to well-connected people so that they alone could deal with slaves, with sugar and rum and some of the big tobacco, some of the big money makers, and of course tea. And so there was resentment, popular resentment back here in the States about that. So they were going to enforce it more strictly with the Sugar Act. And they also put a tax for the first time on commodities without asking the colonial assemblies to consent to those taxes, right? To give their, quote, permission. And the Parliament is going to respond in the midst of the Stamp Act by the end of it with the famous Declaratory Act. And in the Declaratory Act, they stated, we don't need colonial assemblies' permission to tax the American colonists because they are virtually, not literally, but they are virtually represented in Parliament. And of course, the leaders of the American Rebellion were not cool with that interpretation. The Stamp Act affected more people than the Sugar Act, arguably. Well, I don't know about that actually, but what it did do is it alienated lawyers and powerful people in the colonies who were affected by having to buy a stamp for every legal document, etc. And it made a powerful enemy in doing such. Notice 8 assemblies met together in colonial protest to contend that they were not going to collect any taxes that had not received their permission first. And so now we're talking about borderline civil disobedience, right? The idea that there are higher laws in nature by God, or just that are transcendent. And there are man-made or civic laws, and sometimes man or civic laws do not meet they contradict natural laws. And so it is your moral obligation to refuse to cooperate with those man-made laws. And so that was a pretty revolutionary idea. And you see that here at the end of the Stamp Act. And then it just progresses. You have the Boston massacre of 1771. Just 5 people were killed, but that's 5 too many, obviously. But they exaggerated it in the newspapers and in pamphlets, etc. And that had begun with a fist fight between a British soldier and an American young colonist over a job at a rope making factory. Um, and the British fired into a crowd of people throwing snowballs and rocks at the gathered soldiers, the British soldiers. You have the English East India Company receiving a monopoly on tea, as well as putting a tax on it. And so symbolically against that occurred the Boston Tea Party. And yeah, you had the Townsend Acts with involving other external taxes that were protested. And it's just a sequence of events of some type of law passed by Parliament and a reaction of the colonists. But important in the story are the grassroots organizations, supposedly, the Sons and Daughters of Liberties that engaged in boycotts, and tarred and feathered British officials that tried to collect taxes. The committees of correspondence were significant, and that they tried to spread correspondence between the different assemblies of the 13 different colonies, so that if the rights of one colony were being infringed upon, all the other colonies could help that colony out and they could gang up together. So yeah, it reads like it makes a good story. And then ultimately, they're going to try to make a lesson of Boston and Massachusetts. They're going to shut down the port of Boston. They're going to shut down the Colonial Assembly. The royal governors in 9 of the 13 colonies began making ultimatums to their militiamen, as well as to their assemblymen, their elected representatives, to choose a side. And they split. The famous ratio is made by John Adams that he thinks about a third of the colonists willfully and enthusiastically joined the rebellion. About a third stayed loyal to England, and about a third tried to stay out of it. So for whatever that's worth. And so at any rate, those in the assemblies who decided that they were going to stand their ground and demand taxation by consent began to have to meet secretly and separately from the royal council and their royal governors. And then they became known as kind of renegade organizations that were no longer recognized by England. And they're going to join up and form the Continental Congress. And then the militiamen who decide to stay loyal to the rebel cause are going to pride themselves on being ready at a minute's notice to stand for their rights. And so the euphemism for them at that day was Minutemen. And so in Massachusetts, when that happened, the other colonies began to meet with their illegal now assemblymen to raise an army. And when word spread of that, and them collecting arms and gathering to fight, General Gage in Boston was sent to Concord, Massachusetts, to arrest some of the ringleaders and take away their weapons. And on the way there in Lexington, supposedly no one knows is certain of who fired the first shot, but these Minutemen stood in their way and they began firing on one another, and lives were lost. And by the time Gage made it back to Boston from his trip to Concord, he was surrounded by a Minuteman army that forced Gage and the British soldiers to evacuate Boston, go momentarily back up to Canada to bring more troops. And at least 30,000 troops were sent into New York alone, and they began just leveling the Minutemen. And that's when it was on. The Continental Congress sent out one last olive branch petition to King George III, and King George III contended that he didn't want to hear it, that they had crossed the line, basically, in meeting in this Continental Congress and forming an army and fighting against his soldiers. So they fought for from 1776 or 1775 to 1783, and the 13 colonies won by attrition. They just simply outlasted the British. They got help from France by way of a treaty, and people like Lafayette and Lacombe de Rochambeau were of great help to the rebel cause. And the English had the Americans on the ropes in New York on at least one occasion, and had what was left of the Continental Army surrounded and allowed them to escape, kind of in Dunkirk fashion, to fight another day. And the war became unpopular back in England. There were fistfights in Parliament. People were standing up and saying that we shouldn't fight against our American cousins, that they have English rights, etc. But of course, it went beyond that in American rhetoric. They began declaring natural rights. And so the first interpretation is called salutary neglect, as to how to interpret this war for independence. And this one basically likens the American colonists to kids that were ignored by their father, their patriarch, Great Britain or England, and began to become self-sufficient and do things well themselves. They traded and produced goods without the proper papers and got away with it. They accumulated powers, the assemblymen did, as far as rights of trial by jury, given their consent over taxes, having to give their consent over the wages of their governors. They wielded a lot of power, according to this first number in Paul Johnson's book. And so then finally, at the end of the French and Indian War, the father becomes resentful of the defiance of his proverbial son and says, okay, son, now it's time for some rules to be properly enforced. And of course, the son says, sorry, dad, too little, too late. I'm doing too well. I'm flourishing economically. Politically, I've already have acquired a lot of power in the assemblies. And now that I've had a taste of the good life, I'm going to fight to keep it. I'm not going to give it up voluntarily. So that's technically the, I think often the English interpretation to our war for independence, that we were a bunch of spoiled brats who grew accustomed to having our own way with things. Number two is court history, because it adheres to the idea of American exceptionalism, that we were enlightened by the ideological forces that were spreading in the 1700s. So one of them, right, is the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment of the 1740s. And you have the concepts of natural rights, rights that people by nature of just being human beings are entitled to once they're born. You have the right of self-cultivation by writers like Diderot and Condorcet, that every human being ought to have the right to better him or herself, to become educated, to become skilled in an economic industry of some sort, and to just rise as far as his or her own merits can take that person, right? And I think it stands as like an axiom, as an assumption that we don't even question today, that should be the truth, but not back then. That was a rather novel idea in mercantilist Europe, where aristocracies existed that had special privileges that other people didn't have, etc. You have the rights of suspects by Beccaria, and he wrote about certain rights that people ought to have that we now see enshrined in the Constitution. The right to counter your hostile witnesses, the right to be represented in court by a a lawyer, the right to not have to be forced to incriminate yourself, and so forth, right against unreasonable searches and seizures, etc. So that was another modern notion of Enlightenment notion of natural rights. You have Voltaire. Voltaire was really big on freedom of speech. And one of his followers became famous for contending, and it was kind of ascribed to him. I disagree with what you're saying, but I defend to the death your right to say it. And so Voltaire was an iconoclast, kind of like South Park. He deliberately trashed everything that society held to be sacred. And he felt like he had the right to do it on principle, to question everything, to question everyone, that no one or no position in society ought to be sacrosanct, right? Ought to be above criticism and to be held as being, you know, like the medieval ages looked at the Pope, right? It's just absolutely, you can't question what he says is the infallible truth all the time, etc. Voltaire was the nightmare to that old deference to leaders. All right. And so those are a few examples. And then, of course, you have the idea of the social contract and the right to life, liberty, and property by John Locke, and also a guy named Jacques Rousseau. And their notion is that ideally the first government was likely given permission to rule over the people. That if you go back far enough in time when people were hunters and gatherers, etc., that at one point they must have lived in the state of nature with no government, just anarchy, each man and woman for him or herself. But that people being who they are will ultimately abuse that liberty and begin infringing on the natural rights of their neighbors. And they might begin extorting them, right? Saying, hey, catch me some fish and food and cook it for me, or I'm going to kill you. Or give me that, give me your weapon, or else I'm going to harm you, etc. And infringing on people's natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and taking one another's stuff, etc. So that begrudgingly, they surmised, the first government was brought together by permission, by consent of the people, but that government was not the ruler per se, to lord it over the people, but that government was the servant of the people, right? Its purpose was to protect those natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And so the idea of the social contract and government by consent became very popularly espoused at this time. And then, of course, I lied. I'll give one more example, and that's ideas of checks and balances by a guy named Montesquieu in his book, Spirit of the Laws. And Montesquieu contended that people cannot be trusted with arbitrary power, with power to do as they please, because they will inevitably abuse that power. So there must be a system of checks and balances, of written constitutions, prohibiting certain activities, permitting certain activities, but certain activities alone. And then one branch of government ought to have checks and powers over another branch, as that other branch should have checks and powers over it as well, and create a sense of accountability and equilibrium in government. Then you have the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment, to me, I just summed up just from the one book I've read on it. And I apologize, I haven't read more on it, but it's at its heart, it's libertarian. And remember, libertarian is government don't tread on me, a fear of the natural aggrandizement of power and abuse of power, like I was just mentioning with Montesquieu, that people cannot be trusted with too much power, and that they will inevitably try to excel, put their foot on the pedal, and accumulate more and more power than they originally received. And so hence they thought that government ought to be accountable, They thought government ought to be decentralized and small and localized because they felt like it would have fewer resources, and that if people knew where their politicians lived and lived nearby them, that there'd be more of a sense of accountability to the people and fear of abusing them. They were big on the right to bear arms, not wanting the government to be able to ever turn on its own people, so that there should be an armed population. And they were against deference um, to all the authorities, political authorities and church authorities, because church and state were united as the Anglican Church in England. And so they were very skeptical of those institutions and wanted people to freely criticize them and hold them accountable. And then lastly, with the ideas that were spreading at this time, is you have the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening, to me, was about, conditional deference, right? Remember, deference, like in Japanese society, is knowing your place and deferring to your superiors and not questioning them, obeying them, right? With this religious awakening, as they contended, you should only show deference when your leaders are following God and God's laws. So it was primarily aimed against the Anglican clergy, contending that they had become too political, too worldly, and too corrupt, and too puffed up with power, and that they were no longer following the gospel and the Bible and God's ordinances. And so therefore they said that they felt freedom. Some of them felt freedom to separate from the Anglican Church. Some of them felt free to demand reform within the Anglican Church. But supposedly those ideas, that idea of conditional deference that started with a religious movement, kind of carried over to politics as well, and not wanting to obey political leaders either, who were abusing their power or were seen as corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. So number two contends that those are the things that we were influenced by, and that's what we fought for. And that's what we stand for as a country today, this enlightened country. Okay, so that's kind of a rose-colored romantic view of our war for independence. It's what we like to think of ourselves to this day as an exceptional country. And then with number three, you see the self-interest and the ambition, the selfish ambition of George Washington and perhaps other founding fathers like him, whereby he had some clear ambitions, and those ambitions were thwarted by the British system of patronage. Patronage is that you have to have the right last name and the right family connections to get the job. And of course, Washington wanted it to be as if it were by merit, right? And he clearly contended that he was a good farmer, and he didn't need the counting houses and the merchant middlemen that were stripping away his profits and making foolish business decisions on behalf of his cash crops. He wanted to be able to make those business decisions himself. And he also felt like he was a very valiant, intelligent military leader. And a guy named Braddock got the job that he wanted. And he was angry about that and felt like it was unfair, because he felt like Braddock was incompetent and only got the job because of his family connections. So is that part of the reason why some of the founding fathers joined the rebellion? Is because their personal ambitions had been thwarted. And then number four is a very cynical thesis by Howard Zinn. And he says that the poor had become fed up with the rich, and not just the British rich, but the American rich as well. And that you see that in the Stamp Act riot. You see that in the regulator movement You see that in the New Jersey and Pennsylvania mutinies of soldiers during the War for Independence. You see that in Massachusetts, complaints about their own elected assemblymen. And so he contends that those shrewd foxes, the founding fathers, did not want the poor's wrath to be directed toward them, so that they hijacked this rebellion. They took it over, and they used the British as convenient scapegoats for the anger and the grievances of the poor people. And so that they could save their own skin, and so that they could also be the top guys left once the British had become defeated. So very cynical thesis, but something to think about. So according to Zen, right, all of that stuff about the Enlightenment, Scottish libertarianism, the Great Awakening, etc., right? To him, that's mere propaganda. That's the rich founding fathers lying and giving false promises to the poor so that they would fight with and for them instead of against them by promising them something after independence. And number 5, I contend that yes, Latin America became a mess. There were multiple coups and revolutions and scrapped constitutions in early Latin American countries once they had won their independence from Spain by the 1820s. But God bless them, because they at least made an effort to make meaningful, radical changes in a very inequitable system that the American founding fathers did not have the stomach or the heart to even attempt. So for instance, with the North Americans, right, they kept citizenship a state issue. Each state got to decide for itself who could be a citizen and who couldn't. And what do you know? Almost without exception, you had to be a property owning white male to be a citizen in virtually every state. Slavery by the time of the Constitution, because remember we tried a confederation for a few years, which didn't last. By the time they made the Constitution for our federal republic that we have now, they gave explicit approval of slavery, right? You find it in the Constitution, although they don't use the word, right? They use euphemisms for it, persons under contract, etc. But it's still there. They gave their pretty much explicit approval for slavery. And so nothing close to universal citizenship. They declared vaguely the right to Republican forms of government in all states, but that was not enforced. As you see, especially in the South, you can make the argument they were far from Republican in form. And they made no stand for women, no stand for Native Americans. They made no easy avenue for naturalization of citizens to become, or of immigrants to become citizens. So they didn't take any big risks. They developed a very kind of conservative consensus that rich white men, WASP men, right, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, were going to run the early United States. And so, of course, because they didn't ruffle any feathers, they didn't cause any waves, the young United States was able to stay united, because of course they kicked that can down the road for future generations to grapple with, as far as rights of Black Americans, etc., right? And of course, it's going to rear its ugly head back up in the form of the Civil War in the 1860s. And so, but for now, right, from 1787 up to the Civil War, the United States was arguably rather consistent. There were no coups. There were only peaceful transitions of power. There were no revolutions. The 1787 Constitution was never scrapped in favor of a new one. And you can't say the same for Latin America. But in Latin America, they tried meaningful change, and they should deserve credit for doing such. So Miguel Hidalgo, right, and Father Morelos as Mexican priests, these guys were heavily influenced by the French Enlightenment, that they met at Chilpancingo. And let's see here. Sovereignty should reside in the people, and male suffrage, male political citizenship, right, to run for office, to vote, etc. And male suffrage should be universal. Slavery and all caste systems should be abolished. Government monopolies should be abolished and replaced by a 5% income tax. We don't do that till the progressive era of the 19 teens. All judicial torture should be abolished. That's a rather progressive, ahead of its day document, right? And so they really tried radical ideas. They also tried a little bit of Fourier type socialism, where certain villages would collaborate and communally own together the resources and control the means of production, right? And so that was far-reaching. That was radical. The idea of all men of all color, because remember, there was a lot of miscegenation and a lot of slaves also in Mexico. So you have men of a vast variety of pigmentation in Mexico. And to say this early on, that they wanted all men to have the right of political participation, wow, that sure as heck didn't happen in the US. So you look up people like Pedro Dominguez Murillo, Francisco de Miranda, Andres Bello, Vicente Guerrero, Fathers Hidalgo and Morelos, Antonio Nariño. They took the Enlightenment seriously and really wanted to implement those ideas of universal citizenship, at least for men. Sorry, ladies. Not even they were ready for that yet. But what a major step ahead. But the problem is when you look at the conservatives who fought them, what I stayed up here is this type of boldness elicited or brought about an equal and opposite reaction in Latin figures who stood for the Ancien regime, for the pre-French Revolution, pre-Enlightenment, medieval type world. Constitutional monarchies, an aristocracy, a state-established church, ruled by men of Spanish blood only. So this caused great polarization. So many civil wars and coups or military takeovers, and great instability ensued. But at least they had the courage to really shake things up. And that's my main point. And as I end at the end, I say, no good deed goes unpunished, right? That Latin America is going to suffer instability in its first years, but it's going, at least they tried to bring about fundamental change. In Mexico, right, the forces, the liberal forces just could not prevail Guadalupe Victoria, Vicente Guerrero, Santa Anna, although he's going to change sides. They tried their best, but Agustin de Iturbide, uber conservative Mexican politician, and his forces were just too strong. And so they made a deal. They made a compromise with the Plan de Iguala. And with that plan, they decided that they were going to have a constitutional monarchy, a state-established church, and equality between criollos, American-born, Mexican-born Spaniards, and the peninsulares, the Spaniards from Spain. So those three guarantees were not very liberal, were not very radical. But people like Hidalgo, people like Guerrero, and others, they at least tried, and they just couldn't win on the battlefield. And then in South America, uh, you have Simon Bolivar, and he was very interesting in that he was kind of like Napoleon, who had supported the French Revolution and the radical ideas thereof. He implemented the Napoleonic Code that was rather progressive, ahead of its day, but he ironically ruled as a dictator himself. And that's what Simon Bolivar did. When you look at his famous Jamaican letters, he tried at least 2 times before he was successful. On at least 2 occasions, he had to leave South America because he was losing so overwhelmingly on the battlefield. And in one of those 2 occasions, he fled as a refugee to Jamaica, and the English took him in and gave him hospitality, etc., and supported him returning and trying again. But while he's in Jamaica, he wrote, and of course, American Whig historians just run with it, who contend, right, that English America is superior, etc. It's very, very one-sided, lopsided, unfair historical narrative. But Whig historians look at this and say, see, Simon Bolivar said it himself. As Bolivar said, the people of South America are not ready for self-government. They haven't had the practice that the Norte Americanos have had. And so I'm going to have to rule a bit with an iron fist. And so he didn't just content himself with Caracas, Venezuela. He took over 2 other countries, Bolivia and not Ecuador. Shame on me. It might have been Colombia nearby, just above him. At any rate, he took over 2 other countries and formed a confederation of 3 countries, and he ruled with an iron fist over them. But he had an enlightened code. And so, like I said, he kind of followed the steps of Napoleon in some ways. And so it brought about discontent and instability in Latin America, and inequity. And so it's not a favorable ending to this number. But as I contend, at least they had the heart and the stomach to try fundamental change in Latin America, including Mexico. All right. So does anybody have any questions? I want to get your name down. Caroline Hernandez. Thank you for joining us. All right. Can I get a thumbs up that you guys have been able to hear me and follow? Thank you, Rigoberto. All right. Thank you very much. And by the way, another very important part of the narrative of Mexico and of Latin America's independence was Napoleon himself, right? If I failed to mention that, thank you, Caroline. And that is that Napoleon took over Spain. And so thus ensued in 1808 a political vacuum of power, and different juntas or committees began organizing amidst Spain's guerrilla war and of course not the animal, right? Guerrilla, little war. It's guerrilla war. Different cities of Spain tried to claim at different points that they were the true voice of Spain, while the king and his son, his heir, it was Carlos IV and his son Fernando VII, were taken custody hostage by Napoleon. And Napoleon put his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, and no one in Spain or in America acknowledged Joseph as the true crown. But here in the Americas, on the one hand, on the surface, it seemed as if they were united, and that they early on contended we're for the sovereignty of Fernando VII, of the Sun, because for various reasons, because of corruption, and mainly that corruption, they had lost, Carlos IV, the father, had lost credibility throughout the Americas and in Spain itself. So there was almost a universal cry for Fernando VII, but they didn't know if Napoleon was going to have that kid arrested, indefinitely, or even worse, killed. And so in the meantime, that's where you have dissension in the Americas and in Spain, is different cities, including Mexico City and Quito. They tried it in Lima, but failed, and the leaders were killed. They tried it in several places, and the leaders lost their lives doing this to the viceroys, the conservative viceroys, of course, right, who want to keep the old way of establishing things prevailing, because, of course, they benefited from it. They were in a high position of power. But they declared, right, in the meantime, they declared in some cases, including Mexico City, popular sovereignty, saying that the sovereignty starts with us, the people of this city, and we give our permission for Fernando VII to become our eventual leader, our eventual king. But in the meantime, we are not subject to any junta back in Spain, like in Cadiz. In Cadiz, they tried to unite with the Americas, the city of Cadiz. And in Spain, they formed what they called a Cortes, a parliament, and they offered representation to the American states, to each of the American viceroyalties, to be represented in this parliament, to try to keep them, right? But they said that representatives in the Americas could only be a third in number as the Spaniards. So it wouldn't be true representation, because there was a more dense population in Latin America than there was in Spain itself. And so those, when they met in South America, in Quito, under Jose Mejia Lequerica, they contended, we do not accept Cadiz's invitation, primarily because they will not count our people of color, and our people of color are to be citizens like the rest of us. So like I said, some really brave, bold declarations throughout Latin America that you don't find in North America. At least you don't find prevailing in North America. All right. So any questions? I'm kind of finished, unless you have a question.
I had a few questions, Professor. I had emailed you. I just hadn't seen any feedback, so I was concerned. I haven't seen any grades. So I was like, am I doing it wrong? I'm in beginning English to learn how to write essays and all that good stuff. So I don't know if my papers are not up to, your standards.
Sure. All I could tell you is, first of all, apologize, and I will catch up. Okay, Shanice, I'm so sorry.
Okay, I'll just keep doing my best then.
Yeah, please, and I'll give you feedback. Okay, I promise.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, this class is relatively new to me, so I'm writing these weekly, and so I'm just staying just a week ahead of each of you. And I'm also, because I didn't receive the enrollments low at the two schools in which I'm employed. And normally I have 3 classes at each. I just have 1, and now with you guys, a second one. And so I'm subbing during the days for extra money. And so it's no excuse, but I really have been busy. But I will catch up, Shanice. All right. Any other questions? All right, so you guys feel okay? Can I get a thumbs up that you guys are ready to pounce on this assignment and we could call it a day? Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Roberto. All right. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, I'll go ahead and call it a day. And I'm going to go ahead to make sure that we stay ahead of schedule. I'm going to go ahead. I'll send out an announcement, but I'm going to go ahead and do one on Friday as well at 4 o'clock. So I'd love if you could make it. All right. So with that having been said, we'll go ahead and call it a day. Thank you so much for attending. And I will happily give you extra credit points on this assignment for doing such. All right. So take care. You too, Roberto.